Rowan had always been more comfortable with ink and parchment than with conversation. In her small, sunlit studio on the outskirts of the city, she spent her days crafting the swirl of letters into breathtaking messages. The rhythms of her life were arranged around the careful shape of each stroke, the geometry of letters, and the precise placement of every curve. She found a calm solace in the slow dance her pen performed, and so she seldom thought about what might be missing from her quiet existence. If a twinge of loneliness ever surfaced, the fluid grace of her work or the distant notes of her favorite instrumentals eased her mind. Besides, love stories were best written in calligraphy. She mused, kept at a neat distance from her own affairs. One late afternoon, as the golden light slanted across her cluttered desk, Rowan received a call that piqued her curiosity. The voice on the other end of the line introduced herself as Isabella Young, a bride in search of impeccable wedding vows, beautifully written and styled. A wedding was imminent, explained Isabella, and she wanted the script to be a flawless testament to her future. Rowan could hear anxiety in the woman's voice, but also a certain determination. Still, Isabella's words were crisp and direct. She said she had secured Rowan's name through a bridal forum and insisted this commission was urgent. The date was set for only 3 weeks away. Drawn in part by the challenge of a tight deadline, Rowan agreed to a face-to-face meeting the next day. She reminded herself that business encounters were manageable if she approached them like her calligraphy, calmly, precisely, and with as few wasted words as possible. After locking up her studio for the evening and carefully storing away her handcrafted pens, she made her way home, every step accentuating a new swirl of possibilities in her mind. The next morning, Rowan laced up her comfortable flats, donned a soft gray wrap, and arrived at a cafe that Isabella had suggested. It was an airy place, complete with a few potted plants and warm wooden tables. Isabella was there already, leaning forward with a phone in one hand and a half-finished latte in front of her. She looked up and waved curtly, as if she was short on time. Rowan walked over and introduced herself, her voice as gentle as the brush of a fountain pen against fine stationery. Isabella was striking. Her hair was pinned back in a sleek style, her outfit tailored and expensive. There was an aura of precision to her, something that put Rowan on notice that nothing about this wedding or Isabella's life would be done casually. Once pleasantries were exchanged, they got right to the point. Isabella explained that while she had her own vows mostly determined, she wanted them penned in an exquisite form. "We're planning a grand ceremony," she said, her eyes shining with ambition. "Everything must be perfect. The floral arrangement, the table decor, and of course, the calligraphy for the vows." She scrolled through her phone to show Rowan pictures of the wedding venue, a picturesque garden lined with rose bushes that could have come from a fairy tale. Rowan nodded through each swipe. The conversation took a slight turn when Isabella mentioned that she would also like to have her fiancé's vows done similarly, so both vow sheets would look harmonious. Rowan raised an eyebrow. "Will he be writing his own text, or do I need to help with that as well?" Isabella gave a dismissive wave. "Julian's a writer, amateur poet, actually, and I already have a copy of what he's prepared. The problem is that he's never satisfied with finality. He's always revising, rewriting, polishing every word. I'll send you the draft once he's settled." The mild annoyance in her voice was unmistakable, but Rowan attributed it to wedding stress. It was decided Rowan would take Isabella's vow text that very afternoon, refine the formatting, and then hopefully receive Julian's vow draft the coming week. They shook on it, and though Isabella's handshake was quick, there was relief in her eyes. She parted with a clipped, "I'll be in touch," leaving Rowan to wonder if the wedding preparations drained all the gentleness from her, or if that was simply Isabella's nature. Still, Rowan savored the challenge of forging something beautifully lasting out of heartfelt words. She had no idea just how deeply those words would unravel her own well-ordered life. The draft of Isabella's vows arrived via email later that evening. Rowan read them, under the soft glow of a desk lamp, carefully analyzing the structure. It was precise, almost businesslike, and it lacked the sort of tender confessions one might expect from a bride. The vows were about commitment and partnership, about conquering every challenge side by side. Admirable sentiments, Rowan thought, though they somehow felt slightly cold. Yet she was the calligrapher, not an editor of souls. Her job was to make the words glow. Still, she found herself hoping Julian's text would hold traces of the passion and romance that Isabella's seemed to lack. Time turned into days, and the bride's vow calligraphy was shaping up nicely. Rowan allowed herself to get lost in the intricacies of each letter, letting the artistry overshadow the unsettling sense of emptiness in the vow itself. She poured her heart into the pen strokes, as if needing to supplement what the words themselves lacked. Early one morning, a knock at her studio door broke Rowan's concentration. She opened it to find a tall man with warm brown eyes and a lashed leather notebook tucked under his arm. He introduced himself as Julian Anderson, the groom. "I brought my vow draft, and perhaps we could talk about what you need from me to make your task easier." His voice was smooth, a gentle baritone that reverberated with kindness. Despite his somewhat formal greeting, he came across as approachable, a blend of quiet intensity and politeness. Inviting Julian in, Rowan offered him a seat on a stool next to her drafting table. It bore scraps of paper and practice sheets of Isabella's vow in different calligraphy styles. Julian took in the sight, admiring the loops and swirls that formed Isabella's name. "You have a beautiful craft," he said quietly, removing a page from his notebook and placing it gently on the desk. "I'd be honored to have my words receive the same care." Rowan felt warmth at the compliment. She rarely received visitors in her creative sanctuary, and Julian's presence was unexpectedly soothing. He explained that he'd gone through countless versions of his vows and still felt they needed more polishing. Marriage was a big step, a life-altering act, and he wanted to make sure his words spoke true to his heart. He recited a few lines he particularly liked, and Rowan discovered that his voice was mesmerizing. Every syllable carried the weight of meaning, as though each phrase was a small window into a bright interior. She found herself inhaling slowly, letting his words swirl in the air, capturing their shape in her imagination. He paused, perhaps sensing her focus on him, and smiled self-consciously. "I try to choose words that feel genuine," he said, "but sometimes they slip through my fingers and I end up rewriting paragraphs." Rowan nodded in understanding. She seldom used her own words, calligraphy was her expression, but she understood the yearning for perfection when it came to love. Looking over his draft, she noted that it was miles more evocative than his bride's. His lines conjured images of dawn skies and the hush of falling snow, of two souls braving the chaos of life to discover quiet moments of unity. He spoke of laughter that manifested in sidewalk strolls, confessions of fear, and the comfort of a hand held beneath a star-filled sky. "How do they sound when you read them aloud?" she asked, gently pressing him to show more. Julian cleared his throat, and at first Rowan wondered if she was being too bold. But he wore a slight grin and began to speak. The vowels and consonants danced in the space between them, transcending the ordinary. The sincerity in each phrase tugged at Rowan's heart, stirring feelings she rarely granted herself permission to embrace. Suddenly she realized how intently she was watching the shape of his mouth as he spoke, and she felt an unaccustomed warmth bloom in her chest. In the days that followed, Rowan tried not to dwell on Julian's presence. She busied herself refining Isabella's vow calligraphy and executing trial layouts for Julian's. Yet her mind lingered on the melody of his voice. There was a surprising depth in the words he had chosen, a reflection of emotions that could only come from someone who intimately valued love. The next time she heard from him was through a gentle knock at her studio door. She looked up from her desk to see him again, clutching the same notebook, wearing an expression that mixed affection with apprehension. "How's it going?" he asked, stepping inside. He seemed to notice her minor flinch of surprise. I tried calling, but you might have been busy. I have a new version of my vows if you don't mind having a look. A soft chuckle escaped Rowan's lips. You really are a perfectionist, she teased, motioning him to a seat. The tension she usually felt with clients did not appear with Julian. She found herself strangely at ease. That's the funny part, he said, placing the new pages on the desk. I've never been so precise or deliberate with my words before. Maybe the weight of the occasion, or maybe I'm just anxious about the future. He spoke the last few words with a haunted honesty that made Rowan's chest tighten. She reached for the pages and scanned them, her trained eye noticing minuscule improvements in phrasing. One firm declaration of loving someone, through ambiguous midnights and dawns of clarity, caught her off guard, causing an involuntary flutter in her stomach. She recited his lines in a whisper, tasting each sentence. I think it's wonderful, she declared, looking up to see relief flicker across his face. Your sincerity shines through. He murmured his thanks, then asked, would you help me refine my vow structure? I could really use a second opinion. Isabella's not as interested in word choices. She's more focused on the final look. You have an eye for subtlety, I can sense it. In that moment, he looked so vulnerable, like a man offering a secret gift that could be easily broken. Rowan hesitated. She was the calligrapher, not a writing coach. Yet an inexplicable pull stirred in her. She found herself nodding. Sure, we can go through it line by line, if that's helpful. She responded softly, clearing space on her desk. She drew a second stool nearer so they could lean over the pages side by side. As their conversation wove through synonyms, imagery, and the tone of certain phrases, Rowan felt a pang of guilt. She reminded herself that Julian was deeply in love with the bride whose vows she was also meticulously scripting. But why, then, did she sense a note of hesitation whenever he spoke Isabella's name? And why did her own heart skip whenever Julian read his lines out loud? Guilt and excitement twisted together in her core. The faint scent of his cologne mixed with the parchment in the cramped studio, forging an atmosphere ripe with a tenderness Rowan had never before allowed herself. She kept her tone collected, bearing the swirl of confusion beneath a practiced calm. Julian began stopping by more often. Sometimes he brought minor edits, sometimes he just wanted an opinion on a single line. Other times he seemed more in need of a confidant than a critic, as though the wedding's rushing tides were pushing him beyond safe waters. He began sharing small snippets about himself, stories of losing a beloved aunt, who had nurtured his love of literature, recollections of his teenage years spent writing short poems in the empty bleachers of the school gym. One chilly afternoon, it rained nonstop, water streaming down the studio's window panes. Julian came by, soaked despite the umbrella in his hand. Rowan offered him a warm cup of chamomile tea, feeling an unspoken sense of contentment in the hush that seemed to be just for the two of them. They pored over the vow lines yet again, refining some metaphors. Rowan found herself encouraging him to keep the rawness in them, not to over-polish. He took a sip of tea and regarded her carefully. I haven't had the chance to ask much about you. I've been so focused on my words that I apologize if I've been selfish. Rowan fumbled for a response, unaccustomed to sharing details of her solitary life. I'm rather dull, she said lightly, tracing a finger across the rim of her mug. Mostly I just work in here, find beauty in the swirl of letters. I'm not good at crowds or big gatherings. Julian's eyes flickered. But you must see love in so many forms with all these wedding commissions, he persisted. Doesn't that make you believe in it more? She looked up, feeling her cheeks warm. For a moment she considered telling him about the heartbreak she had once suffered, how that was exactly what pushed her deeper into her craft. But she only shrugged. I've learned that love can be sincere or staged. Sometimes the vow texts are as stiff as a corporate memo. Other times, they can be a lullaby of longing. It depends on the couple. And which am I? He dared to ask, the corners of his lips tensing with a hint of anxiety. It took Rowan a long moment to answer. You seem genuine. Every line shows that you believe in the power of love. That's something I admire. Her voice faltered at the end, revealing the sincerity that lurked beneath her self control. For some reason, she wanted him to know she saw him, past the fancy orchestration of a wedding, past the stressful demands of high end event planning. He swallowed hard and nodded, but a shadow passed across his features. I suppose love is complicated, he murmured. Isabella is writing her own vows, but I don't really know what's inside her head these days. And there it was, like a note in a minor key, suggesting something deeper was amiss between them. The confession hung in the air as the rain continued sliding down the glass. That evening, Rowan found sleep elusive. She lay awake, hearing the patter of rain on her window, thinking of Julian's quiet uncertainty. Lighting a small lamp, she pulled out her diary, a simple, unadorned notebook, and began scribbling the feelings she could not confide in anyone else. The lines meandered between longing and guilt, describing the warmth of his presence, the sadness in his eyes, and her own heart's fluttering. She was falling for the fiancé of a woman who had hired her, a situation fraught with principles and heartbreak. She prayed her growing attachment was a fleeting enchantment, just a side effect of witnessing his poetic charm. But deep down, she knew her heart rarely deceived her. Even so, if she was quiet and kept her boundaries, no one would be the wiser. She told herself that. She told herself it was enough to see him occasionally, to hear his voice fill her studio, to watch him refine the words of devotion for another. That heartbreak was a self-imposed penance. In the following week, Rowan tried to keep her distance. She managed to finalize Isabella's vow script and deliver a near-finished version of Julian's. The bride herself appeared relieved, but uninterested in the text content beyond aesthetics. When Rowan tried to inquire about any possible changes or personal touches, Isabella shrugged. The calligraphy looks splendid, she said. Julian can be a bit too flowery for my taste, but at least it'll all look stunning in the ceremony photos. That response struck Rowan like a chill wind, though she disguised her discomfort with a polite smile. Julian did not appear at the studio for several tense days. Rowan forced herself to stay focused on new commissions. She told herself the sensation of missing him would pass. Then, just a week before the wedding, she received a late-night phone call. Julian's voice came through the line, sounding weary, frayed at the edges. "Could I meet you tomorrow?" he asked, speaking in a hush. "There's a final edit of my vows I need to settle." He paused, then added in a softer tone, "Please, it's important to me." The next morning, Julian walked in, and Rowan immediately sensed the upheaval in his spirit. He set his notebook down and exhaled slowly. "We're a week away," he said flatly, "and I don't know if I can do this." His words reverberated in the quiet studio, stirring a mixture of concern and bittersweet relief in Rowan's heart. She motioned for him to sit, her voice gentle. "Is it the vows you're unsure about, or something deeper?" He closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked completely lost. "The words I'm writing, every time I recite them, I realize how true they are," he said hoarsely. "But I'm not sure they're true for the relationship I'm actually in. Isabella is wonderful in many ways, but I feel we're speaking entirely different languages." He let the confession bleed into the open air. "I thought that if I was just careful enough with my vows, I could craft a love that would flourish. But my fiancé is more preoccupied with the performance of the wedding than the union itself." The confession made Rowan's heart lurch. She wanted to console him, to quell his doubt, yet each shared moment only ignited the flame that she had tried so hard to smother. "Have you spoken to her about how you feel?" she asked, pressing her palms together. "It might be that she's just stressed and trying to manage everything as best she can." He sighed. "I've hinted, but she doesn't listen. She's been traveling for work, leaving me to finalize everything. She wants the reception to dazzle. Meanwhile, my vow about the quiet, fragile moments of marriage is an afterthought to her. His voice dropped, pained. And now I realize that what I need most is someone who sees me, not just as a puzzle piece in a perfect wedding portrait. A dangerous heat flared in Rowan's chest. She wanted him freed from the emotional prison of a loveless union, yet simultaneously guilt weighed heavily. Rowan forced herself to keep her voice level. You need to decide if your doubts are momentary or a signal that this isn't right. She swallowed. You have every right to speak your truth, even if it's painful. He gazed at her with an expression of guarded hope. Thank you, he whispered. I appreciate your empathy more than you know. They moved on to the vow text, though the tension crackled in the air. When it was time for him to leave, he paused by the door, turning back to her. Rowan, he said, his voice trembling, your presence has been a steadying force. You've shown me kindness I wasn't expecting. I I don't want to burden you. Just know that you've given me clarity. On the morning of the wedding rehearsal, Rowan received a text from Isabella requesting the final vow prints. Rowan carefully packaged them in protective covers. She spent extra time ensuring the flourishes on Julian's vow page were perfect, though her heart felt heavier than ever. Upon arriving at the grand hall adjacent to the garden, the swirl of people, flowers, and decorations overwhelmed her. She found Isabella in a flurry of last-minute directives. After handing over the vow pages, Rowan slipped away to stand near a column, watchful and quiet. She scanned the crowd for Julian, but didn't see him among the busy staff. Eventually, he emerged from a side room at the far end of the hall, wearing a crisp button-down shirt but looking pale. Their gazes met, and an unspoken conversation passed. He was still uncertain, and she was a vortex of empathy. He approached her, ignoring the curious stares of some onlookers. Hey, he said simply, managing a small smile. How are you holding up? Rowan asked gently, though the question was laden with more than polite concern. He exhaled. I'm about to do a final walkthrough with the officiant. Then I'll recite my vows. But something doesn't feel right. His eyes flickered to Isabella, who was conversing with the wedding planner, tapping on a clipboard. I'm going to speak with her tonight, he said quietly, more to himself than to Rowan. I can't go through with this if it isn't real. Rowan touched his arm, letting her hand hover lightly. Whatever happens, I wish you peace with your choice, she murmured, swallowing the ache in her throat. That evening, Rowan returned to her studio, thinking of the bride and groom. She considered what it would mean if Julian walked away, the heartbreak it would cause, and the quiet spark of possibility that perhaps she was not alone in her feelings. Then she chastised herself for letting such a notion take root. She was an observer, a calligrapher tasked with immortalizing other people's sentiments, not weaving her own into their narrative. The wedding day arrived, bright and warm, the garden in full bloom. Rows of white chairs faced the ornate arch of roses. Guests were already seated, fans fluttering in the mild heat. Rowan, invited to deliver the vow sheets personally, quietly slipped into the back row, unsure if she should even be present. She spotted the bride in a dazzling gown, radiant but strangely unreadable. Family members hovered around her, adjusting her veil. Across the lawn, Julian stood near the officiant, wearing a tailored suit. His posture was rigid, and his expression was caught between dread and resignation. The ceremony began. Soft music filled the air. The bride made her entrance as everyone stood, cameras clicking. Rowan's heart pounded. Had Julian told Isabella his doubts? If so, the show was still going on, and Rowan braced herself for a vow exchange that might feel forced or incomplete. Isabella read hers first, fixating on the script Rowan had meticulously written. Her voice was composed, a professional recital lacking personal warmth. Rows of relatives beamed, presumably moved more by the spectacle than the words. Next, the officiant gestured for Julian to speak. He held the page Rowan had given him, but he made no move to read from it. Instead, he folded it slowly, tucking the parchment into his jacket pocket. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I had some beautifully written words prepared, he began, voice trembling slightly. But I've realized that they're meant for a life that doesn't reflect the truth of this moment. The hush that fell was absolute. Isabella's composure wavered, confusion etching into her features. Julian took a breath, not daring to look at Rowan, who sat frozen at the back. Isabella, you and I have spent months planning a perfect celebration of unity. But we lost sight of the unity itself. I care for you, respect you, but in our pursuit of the ideal wedding, we've overlooked the essence of love we need to share in the years ahead. He swallowed hard. I can't stand in front of everyone and promise I'll be someone I'm not, or that I'll be enough for someone who might not truly see me. There were gasps, a few cries, and an outbreak of hushed whispers. Isabella's cheeks reddened with anger and shock. She opened her mouth, perhaps to demand an explanation, but words failed her. Guests craned their necks, uncertain how to respond. The officiant darted anxious glances between them. Julian's expression was pained yet resolute. Without another word, he turned and walked away from the altar. The hush weighed like a stone, broken by Isabella's sharp exclamation of disbelief. Some members of the congregation slowly rose, uncertain if the ceremony was truly over. Cameras, once capturing a fairy tale scene, dropped in confusion. Heart hammering in her chest, Rowan slipped out as discreetly as she could, weaving through guests who were still too stunned to notice her. She felt relief, sorrow, and a guilty spark of hope all tangling in the pit of her stomach, swirling as chaotically as spilled ink. She rushed to her car, parked at the edge of the lot, only to find Julian already there, leaning against it. His breath was shaky, eyes glistening with tears that had not fully fallen. He looked up at her, chest heaving as if he had just outrun a storm. I'm so sorry, she said, stepping closer. You must be in so much pain right now. His voice was hoarse. I did what I had to do. There's no sense burying myself in a marriage that isn't built on genuine love. He closed his eyes, inhaling slowly, then looking at her again. Thank you for every moment you spent helping me shape my words. In the end, I realized the words weren't for Isabella. They were for someone who... He trailed off, searching her face. Rowan felt her heart stutter, uncertain of what was safe or right anymore. She carefully placed her hand on his, which still trembled. I'm here, she said softly. He nodded, relief flooding his features. They stood there, side by side, the wedding music in the distance finally dying away. She could sense the chaos behind them, the flurry of upset relatives and elaborate decorations that suddenly meant nothing. But in that moment, there was just the quiet space where their entwined paths shone with a fragile new light. For Rowan, it was as though her world of ink and parchment had spilled over, forming a new narrative, one she never anticipated when she had first received Isabella's phone call. She recognized the uncertain future that awaited them. But just as Julian had once poured his heart into carefully chosen words, Rowan could envision a fresh page, a new vow. It wouldn't be for a crowd or for show. It would be real, spoken in hushed tones between two souls who saw each other clearly. I don't know where this leads, Julian whispered, his eyes searching hers. I only know I don't want falsehood, not anymore. Rowan squeezed his hand gently, letting the hope stretch out between them like a line of fine script. Then let's find the truth together, she said. Those words were neither ornate nor rehearsed. They were simple, honest, and exactly what both needed to hear. With the sun setting over a wedding that had halted mid-ceremony, they walked away, leaving behind the trappings of perfection to follow a calling of the heart. One that promised to be raw, messy, and beautifully uncharted, like a new story unfolding in elegant lines across an empty page.